Madam President, thank you. Last month, the Emergency Relief Coordinator informed this Council of the dramatic increase in the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance in Aleppo and Idlib governates since the beginning of the year. Recent weeks have seen a further serious deterioration of the humanitarian situation in the northwest, with intense aerial bombardment and shelling reported in parts of Idlib, Aleppo, Hama and Latakia governates, resulting in the death and injury of civilians and the damage and destruction of civilian infrastructure, including schools, hospitals, placing even more strain on humanitarian responders and vulnerable host communities. Madam President, on the 10th of August, there were airstrikes on the town of al-Qura in western Aleppo, which reported to have killed 41 civilians and wounded more than 70. On the same day, bombs were dropped in Al-Ted and Khan al-Shur in southern Idlib, killing 12 civilians and wounding dozens of others. On the 12th of August, 67 people were reportedly killed and 37 were injured, including many women and children, when a weapons depot in a residential building exploded near Sharmada in rural Idlib. Over the same period, the United Nations Children's Fund reported that 3 health facilities it had been supporting were attacked, rendering 2 of these facilities out of service. Separately, an unconfirmed report was received of a projectile striking the ground of a hospital in Al-Mara, which had been deconflicted according to agreed procedures. In that instant, no casualties or damage to the hospital was reported. School activities were also suspended in several areas due to hostilities. Humanitarian organisations are responding to needs across the northwest, drawing on cross-border assistance deliveries, which continue to provide the critical lifeline for hundreds of thousands of civilians who cannot be reached through other means. Some 680,000 people received food delivered from Turkey during the month of July alone. 254,000 people received health assistance, again during the same period. Alongside ongoing response and pre-positioning of aid, humanitarian partners are finalising a comprehensive readiness plan for people in areas of the northwest being reached by cross-border humanitarian organisations. This plan is intended to guide a flexible response over a 6-month period, complementing assistance mobilised from inside Syria. With an estimated 2.1 million people already in need in areas under non-state armed group control covered by the readiness plan, with humanitarian workers likely to be among the displaced, with many organisations facing increasing funding shortfalls, the efforts of this Council to avoid further escalation of violence and an ensuing humanitarian catastrophe are critical. Madam President, turning to the situation in the southwest, the government of Syria has now regained control over the vast majority of Daraa, Qattara, al-Suwaida governorates. A large-scale return of internally displaced people has already taken place, and fewer than 60,000 people are now estimated to remain displaced across the 3 governorates. However, massive levels of humanitarian need persist, and the United Nations continues to provide aid in partnership with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent and other local organisations. Food assistance has now been provided to more than 390,000 people, as have water and sanitation, education and shelter assistance, as well as protection services. 2 ad hoc interagency convoys delivered hygiene kits, nutritional supplies, sanitary and household items for a total of 40,000 people in Daraas al-Balad and Bura al-Sham on the 9th and 16th of August, respectively. As efforts to scale up protection and basic services continue, more detailed need assessments are also underway, and this will require continued and sustained expanded humanitarian access across the southwest. Madam President, the humanitarian situation remains complex and challenging in other parts of the country. At Rukban, on the Syrian-Jordanian border, the movement of several hundred families out of the camp due to deteriorating living conditions means that the current population is estimated to be approximately 45,000, of whom the vast majority are women and children. The provision of humanitarian assistance in this camp is increasingly urgent. With minimal aid delivery since January, discussions on a humanitarian convoy to the area continue. Close to 150,000 people are now estimated to have returned to Raqqa city. Unexploded ordnance and improvised explosive devices continue to pose a life-threatening risk to returnees and to humanitarian personnel. And alongside the insecurity and resource shortfalls, this is hindering the scale-up of assistance. In Deir el-Zor, ongoing fighting in the east of the governorate has continued to impact civilians, with reports of more than 20,000 people being displaced to makeshift camps between July and the beginning of this month. Many sites hosting new arrivals are not accessible to humanitarian organisations present in the area, and most displaced people are reported to be prevented from leaving the sites, although some have been able to move to other areas to receive medical treatment. The number of people who remain displaced from eastern Ghouta in sites in rural Damascus is reported to have reduced to just below 7,500. The United Nations did not receive authorization to access these sites between mid-June and August. However, the good news is that visits to some of these locations were possible last week. Returns to eastern Ghouta are reported to have continued, although access to the area remains limited, delaying our efforts to scale up assistance and provide the much-needed services, including for returnees. Madam President, World Humanitarian Day was held on the 19th of August to pay tribute to aid workers and rally support for people affected by crises around the world. Syria remains among the most dangerous countries in the world for humanitarian workers and healthcare providers. Many have been directly targeted in the course of their work or forced to flee their homes. Hundreds have lost their lives. We continue to remind all parties fighting in Syria of their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect and respect humanitarian relief personnel. Madam President, the Emergency Relief Coordinator is in Damascus today to engage with the government of Syria on how best to further scale up collective humanitarian response across Syria and how to ensure that those in greatest need are assisted and protected. His visit coincides with the visit of the High Commissioner for Refugees. The Council's engagement is also critical to ensure de-escalation in Idlib and surrounding areas, to ensure safe, unimpeded and sustained humanitarian access, and to ensure the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. Hundreds of thousands of people are already experiencing dire humanitarian conditions in overcrowded sites in which basic services have been stretched to breaking point for months. Madam President, humanitarian organisations are doing what they can with the resources available to them to sustain the current response and prepare for possible further deterioration, thanks in large part to cross-border assistance and the generosity of our financial donors. But a worst-case scenario in Idlib will overwhelm capacities and has the potential to create a humanitarian emergency at a scale not yet seen through this crisis. We therefore call on the members of this Council to do all that they can do to ensure that we avoid this. In the words of Kofi Annan, I quote, "We have the means and we have the capacity to deal with our problems, if only we can find the political will." End quote. Thank you, Madam President.